Lesson 2 describes the service transition process called Service Asset and Configuration Management. The SACM process has 6 objectives. First, we'll talk about the main objective of the Service Asset and Configuration Management process. Next, we'll introduce the term configuration item and we'll learn how it fits into SACM. Then, we'll learn some key service asset and configuration management terms, and there are a lot in this process. Next, we'll learn about the 2 main tools of SACM, the Configuration Management Database and the Configuration Management System. We'll also review the main activities of the SACM process, and we'll finish up with a rundown of the roles within Service Asset and Configuration Management. The main objective of Service Asset and Configuration Management is to define and control the components of services and infrastructure and maintain accurate configuration information on the historical, planned, and current state of the services and infrastructure. Wow, that's pretty long, huh? So let's break this down. First, it says to define and control the components of services and infrastructure. Let's pretend that we have a service called email, and this is a service that IT provides to the business. If we were to make a list of all the generic stuff that we need to make email go, and I'm intentionally using kind of fuzzy words there. If we were to come up with a list, it would probably look similar to this. Servers, networks, computers, we need administrators, we need software, firewalls, storage, a security policy. We need all sorts of stuff to make email as a service go. And this list could be huge. We could get as granular as you'd like, but this is a nice quick list. All of these things are components of the service. And components of services are called CIs, or configuration items. The term CI, or configuration item, is a term that you'll need to live and breathe for the IDLE exam. If you want to make your life easy, you can think of CIs as fitting into 4 categories: hardware, software, people, documentation, and the relationships between them. The items on this list on the left are all CIs, and you can categorize them into those 4 groups. A server is a type of hardware, an application is software, administrators and users are people, and the acceptable use policy is documentation. But we also need to track the relationships between CIs. This software lives on this server lives on this network, and this computer belongs to this user. Now let's look back up top and we'll check out the second half of the objective. And maintain accurate configuration information on the historical, planned, and current state of the services and infrastructure. So that tells us that we need to record all of this data about these CI someplace, and that repository is called the Configuration Management Database, or the CMDB. What makes the CMDB special is that it stores the records of all of these CIs, but it also stores the relationships between them. Typical relationships are is a parent of, or is a component of, or is installed on, etc. You can make these relationship names up on your own. These aren't IDLE prescribed. So if I need to make a change to a server, I can look in the CMDB and see what that server's used for. But thanks to relationships, I can also use it to understand what that server is plugged into and what service this server is a component of. That's pretty handy, and that picture that it provides is called a configuration model. We'll talk more about what a configuration model is in a moment. But for now, let's try something. Using the information we just learned on this slide about what configuration items are, count up the number of CIs in this image. I'll give you a few seconds. When I do this exercise in a class, some students say it's 1 CI. It's Sally's workstation. Some people say it's 4 CIs. We have the monitor, we have the box, we have the keyboard, and we have the mouse. Other people say it could be 10 CIs. It's the monitor, it's the keyboard, it's the mouse, it's also the hard drive. This particular machine has a floppy drive we can see. Other people will say it's even more than that because we also want to track the software on it as well. And the answer is you're all correct. How many CIs are in this picture? As many as you want. It's up to each individual organization to determine what level of granularity they want to track to. For example, some people just want to call this 1 CI, Sally's workstation, and other people want to get down to what the serial number is on each individual hard drive inside all the machines that they have. When you're first deciding how to populate your CMDB, you need to decide how detailed you want to get. If you choose to capture many CIs as well as many attributes about your CIs, the good news is that you'll have a lot of control over your IT environment. If you remember a few years back, there was a major laptop manufacturer that had some issues with their power supplies and that they were catching on fire. So if your CMDB tracked serial numbers and model numbers, you would be able to proactively pull a list of all the folks whose laptops met those criteria and then replace their power supplies proactively. The challenge of tracking all this stuff is that your CMDB is giant, and that's not inherently a bad thing, but it just means that the person, your configuration librarian, who is the person who has to maintain your CMDB, will have a lot of work to do. The rule of thumb is don't call something a CI unless you are willing to track it throughout that CI's entire life, from the moment it's purchased to the moment it's disposed. Some people choose to keep their CMDB small, and with a smaller CMDB, there's less to maintain. But of course, you don't have quite the control. It's a trade-off, so you need to make the right decision for your organization. Let's learn some service asset and configuration management vocabulary, and as you can see, there's a lot here. All of these terms are going to show up on an exam, I'm sure of it, so you want to know this slide. The first word we have here is CI, or configuration item. We've already learned this word. Each CI record has information about it that we call attributes, and history that we call a status. Attributes of a CI could be things like serial number, and the CI status could be things like in production or on back order. Next, we have the big brother of the CMDB called a configuration management system. The CMS is a tool, or even a set of tools, that we use to manage our configuration data. Sit tight because in a few slides I'll show you an image of the CMS and we'll talk about the different components of the CMS and how the CMS enables us to pull information out of multiple databases and data sources at once. We've already talked about the CMDB, so now we'll move on to our next repository called the DML, or the Definitive Media Library. The DML is a single logical storage area where we store our approved and official versions of electronic media CIs, and it's also where we install these electronic media CIs from. But what's an electronic media CI? Well, think about it. We know that our CIs are hardware, software, people, documentation. So the electronic media CIs are the software and the documentation. Now, when we say that the DML is a single logical storage area, that doesn't mean that it has to be one physical location where all electronic media are stored. You may choose to store your shrink-wrap software in this drawer over here in this desktop person's cube. Then you can choose to store all of your patches on this server share over here. And what about that stuff that you developed in-house? Well, that's stored on that server over there. That's completely fine to have these in different places, as long as these files aren't duplicated anyplace. We need to make sure that there is a single definitive version, and that's the only version we're allowed to install. Records of our electronic media CIs are stored here in the CMDB. The physical installation media is stored in your DML, whether it's a CD or a DVD physically stored in a drawer or a closet, or whether it's an MSI or an EXE file stored on an installation share. We just can't have more than one place to install the same thing from. It's important to remember that the DML is owned and managed by this process right here, Service Asset and Configuration Management. However, it's used the most from a day-to-day perspective from a process we haven't talked about yet, called Release and Deployment Management. Release and Deployment Management is the process we follow when we need to install stuff. So if you're a desktop technician, you're going to be installing stuff. And where do you install it from? The Definitive Media Library. And what process are you following when you're installing things? Release and Deployment Management. So why would the DML be owned and managed by Service Asset Configuration Management when we use it the most during the Release and Deployment Management process? Because it's just one of those things. You might be asked that tricky question on an exam, so try to keep it straight in your head that the DML, the Definitive Media Library, is owned and managed by the Service Asset and Configuration Management process. If you're still a little fuzzy on this, and that's totally okay if you are, just refer to the book that came with this DVD and it'll be clarified for you. The next term we have is a configuration baseline. A baseline, in general, is a measurement, and it's usually the first measurement you take of something. Baselines are always used for later comparison, so we can see what's changed since we took the baseline measurement. Since right now we're talking about the Service Asset and Configuration Management process, let's talk about a configuration baseline specifically. If we were to take a snapshot of my laptop today, we would see that it has Windows Vista Service Pack 2, Office 2007, and 2 gig of memory. When we take another snapshot 6 months from now, we'll see that it has Windows 7, Office 2010, and 4 gig of memory. So we can compare this new snapshot to our baseline to see what's changed. If something goes wrong with my Windows 7 upgrade, we can use the information contained in the baseline to roll back my laptop to its previous configuration. Our last service asset and configuration management vocabulary word is the configuration model. Did you ever have a model train or model airplane? It's just a representation of the real thing. Same thing with a configuration model. A configuration model is a mock-up or a representation of the services and infrastructure that we can pull out of the various tools that we have at our disposal. And we use these configuration models to simulate what might happen if we were to make a change, because we can see how our configuration items are all related and interconnected. As I warned you before, there's a lot of terms that are here in Service Asset and Configuration Management, so please take your time and study this slide, because these terms you will see again. The Configuration Management System is a system that we use to manage all of the information that Service Asset and Configuration Management has access to. It contains the details of all of the components of the IT infrastructure, and that stuff is probably stored in your CMDB. If your organization outsources some part of its IT infrastructure, you may have more than one CMDB, yours and then the CMDB of the external vendor. The Configuration Management System maintains the relationships between CIs that are found in your CMDB and other types of data. The word relationships is emphasized here, and that's because when you think of the word relationships, you should always think of the process called Service Asset and Configuration Management, as well as the CMS. We'll talk about those relationships on the next slide. Because the CMS is a system, it's made up of one or more CMDBs and many other data sources. Some of these data sources that you'll see here in the red box are data sources that we haven't yet talked about, but you might already know these terms from your own self-study. So here we have our CMDBs, but our known error database, which is part of problem management, that's also part of your CMS. Your supplier and contracts database, your definitive media library, your capacity management information system, your availability management information system, as well as other repositories that ITIL doesn't necessarily prescribe specifically, but they're still important. All of these data sources are accessible through the CMS. When possible, you should use automated tools to populate your CMS, and of course its constituent databases, and to pull information out of it. Let's talk about those relationships. The CMS records relationships between different types of data. As we saw on the previous slide, the Configuration Management System has many constituent databases. Having this data in their own little databases is certainly handy, but wouldn't it be great if you could pull relationships or federate this data to pull out more meaningful information and see patterns? All the way on our left, we have a record from our CMDB, and this is how we track Sally's PC. You can see the attributes of Sally's PC on this record. Attributes like the asset ID, serial number, MAC address, supplier, location, and we can draw relationships between these different types of data to other data sources. So here's Sally, and there's also a record of Sally in the HR database. And again, the HR database isn't an idle thing, but that's probably something that your HR department has. We'll also have information about Hewlett-Packard, which is where we bought Sally's PC from. We can see that Sally works in the main office, and if we're looking for the address of the main office, we can find it here. And if we need to know what department Sally works in, we can just drill down through the CMS instead of having to open up 4 different databases. The CMS connects it all. A good rule of thumb to remember for the exam is that the Configuration Management System manages relationships between different types of data. On the exam, you might be asked a question like, in which repository would you find data about a single CI? Answer that question using the smallest repository that makes sense. So, what is this server serial number? Where would you look that up? In the CMDB, because that's where information about a single CI would be stored. But if you need to draw relationships between more than one data source, then you're going to look in the parent. You're going to look in the CMS. For example, which PCs were part of last month's upgrade, and which software version did we install? Because we can't get all of that information out of one single database, we're going to have to look in more than one place at one time. And for that, we'll look in the next largest container, or the parent, because only the parent, or the CMS, can draw the relationships between more than one data source. On the exam, you might be asked a question like, which repository tracks relationships between data sources? And that answer would be the CMS, the Configuration Management System. To reiterate, if you need to look up data from one single database, then look just in that database. But if you need to compile information from more than one database at once, then you're going to look in the parent, which in this case is the CMS. The Service Asset and Configuration Management process has 5 main activities. The first step is management and planning. And this is where we sit around and try to figure out how exactly we're going to do service asset and configuration management, because this one's a biggie, and this one is always happening. Our second activity of service asset and configuration management is identification, and this means identifying the CIs that your organization finds value in tracking. Do you want to track keyboards and mice, or is that just too much work for an asset that costs $9? Do you want to track phones in your CMDB, or is that something that the telecom team will do completely on their own? You need to make these decisions here in the identification phase. Next, we have the activity called control, and this is how we make sure that what is in the CMDB is neurotically up to date. Your CMDB needs to be accurate and up to date real time. If you have a CMDB, people are going to be using it and assuming that it's correct. And if it's out of date, somebody might make a decision based on bad data. This activity called control is closely linked to change management, because the only way we can make a change to a CI is to have it go through the change management process. And we'll talk about the change management process coming up next. The fourth activity of service asset and configuration management is called status accounting. And this is an activity where we go into our CMDB and we make sure that every CI has a status flag on it, and that status flag is accurate. Examples of status could be in production, or retired, or in that closet over there that stores our spares. ITIL doesn't prescribe the different types of status, so your organization can come up with status terms that make sense for you. Our last activity of service asset and configuration management is the step called verification and audit. And this is where we make sure that the items in our CMDB accurately reflect reality. An out-of-date CMDB is infinitely worse than having no CMDB. So we need to make sure that what's in the CMDB is accurate and up to date. Let's finish up the service asset and configuration management lesson with a quick review of the roles. Typical roles for this process are a person called the configuration manager, and this is the process owner of the service asset and configuration management process. And like all other process owners, they do the DEMI duties of this process. If you need a reminder of what those DEMI duties are, you can take a look at the book that came with the DVD. You also may have a configuration librarian, or sometimes called a configuration administrator, and this is the person who makes sure that the CMDB is accurate and up to date. This is the person who personally maintains the CMDB. You also might have a CMS administrator or a tools administrator, who's a person who makes sure that all the various data sources can work together and be accessed through the CMS. Also, the change manager has a role here in service asset and configuration management. And I know we haven't talked about change management yet, but it's coming up. So I'll say this now, and I'll be sure to tie it back when we get to the end of change management. But the change manager ensures that the changed CIs are updated in the CMDB or the CMS. Now, your change manager isn't going to be the one who physically inputs it into the CMDB. That's going to be the configuration administrator or the configuration librarian. And this role slide wraps up our lesson on service asset and configuration management. Let's move on to lesson 3, where we'll talk about change management.